Louisiana's humid air clung heavy around the cypress groves, where moss hung like funeral veils from the trees, and the swollen bayou whispered its endless murmur. Cypress Bend plantation spread along the riverbank, its white-pillared house gleaming as if to deny the misery stitched into its soil. Behind the broad veranda, where guests sipped brandy and laughed, rows of slave cabins stretched into the distance, crooked silhouettes of poverty standing against the illusion of grandeur. 16-year-old Caleb moved within that contradiction, his youth hardened by chains, his body lean from endless labor. Though barely past boyhood, he already bore the marks of a man whipped too often, his back ridged with scars that rose like rough bark across his skin. By dawn, he worked with the carpenter, shaping planks, repairing barns, fitting joints for wagons that carried cotton bales. He knew the smell of sawdust, the sting of sweat in his eyes, the deep ache in his shoulders. Yet despite all labor, he was branded lazy. On afternoons when the master's son wished to display his power, Caleb was dragged onto the porch and ordered to sing. His voice clear, low, carrying the sorrow of fields and rivers, was not a gift, but a chain. He sang while fine ladies fanned themselves, while gentlemen clapped in mockery, while children laughed and pointed at the trembling boy forced to bow between verses. Some evenings he was made to kneel on the hot boards until his knees blistered, the master's son placing a boot against his shoulder, pressing him down as if to remind the gathered company of who ruled and who obeyed. The overseer, Briggs, took cruel delight in every chance to break him further. A square-jawed man with eyes like flint, Briggs withheld food when he pleased, sometimes an entire day's ration cut away, leaving Caleb faint in the fields. A crooked nail driven wrong, a moment's pause to wipe sweat, any excuse would summon the lash. Briggs whispered threats of shackles, swore he'd send the boy to the quarters where iron collars choked and chains dragged across dirt floors. Every mistake, real or imagined, became a performance of punishment. But nothing cut deeper than the tearing apart of Caleb's family. His mother, tall, strong, remembered for her hymns sung at night, was sold downriver 2 years earlier. No farewell was permitted. One morning she simply vanished, her absence a wound that never closed. Caleb's younger brother, only 10, had been handed over to a neighboring planter as payment on a debt. Caleb remembered the boy's cries, arms reaching for him until the wagon jolted forward. Since that day, silence haunted his nights, broken only by whispers of prayers unanswered. The yard was a stage where humiliation never ceased. One Sunday, when guests lingered after church, Caleb was accused of sluggishness. Though his hands were cracked and bleeding from a week's carpentry, Briggs dragged him before the assembly. Stripped to the waist, lashed until his knees gave out, he collapsed in the dust as laughter rippled across the porch. The guests clucked at his weakness while sipping sweet wine, as if a boy's pain were no more than a jest at supper. Caleb learned to hold his expression steady, to swallow rage until it thickened like iron in his chest. The blows hurt, the hunger gnawed, but humiliation being treated as nothing, forced to kneel and sing, mocked in front of strangers, burned hotter than the lash. Each day became a ledger of wrongs, his memory storing every insult, every scar, every theft of dignity. At night, lying on the hard floor of the cabin, he stared at the rafters and counted the beats of his own fury. The cabins buzzed with whispers of escape, of rebellion, of prayers for deliverance. Some clung to hope in heaven, others dreamed of the north. Caleb, silent among them, listened but did not speak. He was too young to lead, too marked to be ignored. Yet within him grew something different, not hope, but resolve. The seasons moved, cotton harvested and shipped, the river swollen and receding, but Caleb's world did not change. He watched men break under the lash, women collapse from grief, children vanish into wagons bound for auction blocks. Cypress Bend thrived on their torment, each brick of the mansion mortared with suffering. Still he endured, a boy hardening into a figure neither child nor man, marked not by years but by pain. The turning came one autumn afternoon when the master himself, Halen, decided to make a spectacle. A set of silver spoons had gone missing, and though no proof existed, suspicion fell upon Caleb. Before assembled workers and visiting neighbors, Halen accused him of theft. Caleb stood silent, head bowed, knowing words would only add fuel. The master, face red with drink and pride, ordered a sign made from heavy board. The word thief was painted in bold strokes and hung around Caleb's neck by a rough rope. The boy stood in the yard, forced to wear the burden while guests jeered. Sweat cut rivulets into the dust on his skin. Then Halen's nephew, a boy scarcely older than Caleb himself, spat in his face. The spittle slid down his cheek while laughter thundered from the porch. In that moment, Caleb's silence shattered within, though he showed no sign. Something settled cold in his eyes, a decision coiling where shame had once lived. He bore the sign until dusk, his shoulders aching from its weight, his stomach hollow with hunger, his heart burning with humiliation that seared hotter than the Louisiana sun. Yet he knew now there was no longer a line between endurance and action. From that day forward, Caleb's gaze sharpened. While others saw only chores, he studied routines. He watched when the guards shifted at night, when Briggs left the yard for his whiskey, when the dogs were chained, and when their key lay forgotten on a hook. He marked where the axes were stacked by the woodpile, how the kitchen boy passed through the back gate, and how sometimes, if bribed with a scrap of salted fish or a handful of roasted corn, the latch was left loose. His hands, cracked from labor, learned to measure not just wood and nail, but opportunity. Each humiliation became not only pain, but instruction. He did not yet know when or how, but he knew the day would come. A day when the laughter of the porch would turn to silence, when the sign around his neck would no longer weigh him down, but fuel the fire in his chest. And as Christmas approached, with rumors of feasts and guests and wine, Caleb listened, noted and prepared in secret, a boy no longer willing to kneel. The December air at Cypress Bend carried a chill unusual for Louisiana, a damp cold that seeped into cabins and gnawed through threadbare cloth. In the big house, however, fireplaces roared with oak and pine, casting warmth across carpets and chandeliers. Preparations for Christmas began weeks in advance, the plantation buzzing with forced labor, garlands woven from greenery by trembling hands, tables polished to gleam, casks of wine rolled from the cellars, pigs slaughtered, ducks plucked, and barrels of sugar delivered for pastries and rum. Caleb moved through this whirlwind as both tool and target. His youth, lean frame, and silence made him an easy mark. Overseer Briggs relished shouting at him in front of others, calling him half-grown mule and worthless runt. The other slaves knew to keep their eyes low, for pity itself could earn punishment. Yet in Caleb's chest, the cold ember smoldered, and with each passing day, the ember thickened into steel. The humiliation of the thief sign did not fade. Even after the board was taken from his neck, Caleb felt its phantom weight dragging his shoulders. He walked the yard with lowered head, but inside his eyes counted every hinge, every door, every pattern of movement. Where others saw walls, he saw paths. At dawn he still reported to the carpenter's shed, his hands calloused from saw and chisel. But while fitting joints or hauling beams, he noted how the overseer's ring of keys jingled, which one fit the bell tower, which the gate, which the tool room. He remembered the hook in the kitchen where the dog key hung, how often it was forgotten after evening feedings. He noticed the blind spots of the guards when one stepped behind the stable, when another lingered too long with a bottle near the smokehouse. Evenings were more dangerous, for the big house filled with guests. Yet danger brought knowledge. Caleb was often pulled inside to serve wine, balancing trays heavy with crystal glasses. He learned the layout of rooms, the creak of stairs, the order in which doors were locked. He kept his eyes lowered, but through lowered lashes he measured the distance from parlor to kitchen, from kitchen to cellar, from cellar to the master's study. One night, slipping scraps of bread to the kitchen boy named Jonah, Caleb whispered a request. Jonah was younger, small and hungry, with wide eyes always searching for mercy. Caleb pressed into his palm a twist of roasted corn saved from his ration. In return, Jonah agreed. Whenever Caleb signaled, he would leave the back gate unlatched. It was a small bargain, sealed in silence, but one that burned itself into Caleb's memory like a key forged of trust. As the holiday drew closer, Caleb's anger found its sharpest edge. He had long endured the lash, the hunger, the jeers. But when Master Halen whispered his final decree, the ember burst into flame. It happened on Christmas Eve. The house glowed with candlelight, voices spilling from parlor and hall. Guests arrived in silks and suits, their laughter high and shrill, their bellies eager for feast. Caleb, in a rough white shirt too large for his frame, was ordered to serve. The silver tray wobbled under the weight of glasses and bottles. The air reeked of tobacco and rum. He bowed to each guest, as instructed, his back bent until his neck ached. Near the center of the room, Master Halen loomed. Thick in the waist, his hair slick with oil, his voice carried like a whip crack across the parlor. He drank heavily, boasting of crops and profits, telling crude tales that sent his company roaring with laughter. Caleb moved near, set to refill a glass, when Halen's hand struck the tray. Crystal and wine crashed to the floor, red liquid spread like blood across the carpet. Silence fell for only a moment, then laughter exploded around the room. Caleb stood frozen, glass shards glinting at his feet. Halen leaned close, his breath hot with liquor, his whisper meant for Caleb alone. "After the holiday, boy, you're bound for the sugar fields, down river. They'll work you till you rot." The words struck harder than the tray. Caleb knew what sugar meant. He had heard stories of cane fields where men dropped dead beneath the sun, where whips cracked without pause, where disease and exhaustion devoured lives in months. It was the sentence of a slow execution. The laughter of the guests swelled around him, but Caleb no longer heard. He bent, gathered shards with bare hands, the cuts stinging, blood mixing with spilled wine. Yet his face remained calm, unreadable. He bowed again, retreating toward the kitchen. Inside his chest, the ember erupted into fire. That night, lying on the cabin floor, Caleb stared into darkness. Sleep would not come. His body trembled, not with fear, but with certainty. The plan, long forming in fragments, now took full shape. There was no more waiting. At dawn, fog rolled heavy across the yard, curling low over the fields, muffling sound. Caleb rose quietly, slipped from the cabin, and made for the woodpile. There, stacked rough and damp, lay axes used to split logs for the fires. He chose one with a long handle, its blade nicked but sharp enough. He hefted it once, feeling the weight. Moving quickly, he crossed to the dog shed. The hounds barked low, restless. Caleb found the key where it always hung after feeding, slipped it into the lock, and swung the door shut from outside. The dogs, trapped and silenced, scratched and whined, their warning cries muted by the fog. He moved toward the kitchen door, its latch loose as he knew it would be. Inside, the air smelled of roasted meat and spiced bread. The servants were gone, scattered in confusion after the night's feast. Caleb stepped softly, the axe steady in his hands. He knew the rooms, the corridors, the doors. He knew where Halen slept, where the family lay, where silence would strike hardest. The boy who had been forced to sing, who had knelt with a sign of thief around his neck, now walked with purpose into the heart of the house. His steps were silent, his breath steady. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the plantation in a hush that seemed almost sacred. Inside, vengeance waited. The house lay in uneasy slumber, its grand facade hidden beneath fog as thick as smoke. Inside, embers glowed faintly in the parlor hearth, the scent of brandy and roasted fowl lingering from the feast. The floors creaked under Caleb's bare feet as he moved, the axe steady in his grip. He had studied this path for weeks, from the kitchen through the corridor, past the dining hall, and up the staircase that led toward the family's chambers. In the silence, he could hear the heavy breathing of men still drunk from celebration, the muffled snores of guests who had fallen asleep in armchairs. A glass rolled from a table edge, clinking softly as it hit the carpet. No one stirred. The plantation, so loud with cruelty and command by day, seemed now like a beast drugged into stillness. Caleb advanced with the patience of a hunter. His first target lay in the master's chamber. Halen sprawled on a feather bed, his face slack, mouth open. Beside him the fire burned low, casting shadows across portraits of ancestors staring from gilded frames. Caleb stood at the threshold, the axe rising slowly. For a moment his chest tightened, not with hesitation, but with the memory of every humiliation branded into him. The weight of the thief sign, the laughter of guests, his brother's cries as the wagon rolled away. His mother's absence. The axe fell swift and silent, once, twice. The room filled with the sickening thud of steel on flesh. Helen's body jerked, then collapsed into stillness. Blood pooled across the white sheets, steam rising in the cold air. Caleb's breath came hard, but his resolve did not falter. He turned toward the adjoining chamber where Mistress Helen slept. She stirred at the noise, eyes fluttering open. For an instant, her gaze locked with his, recognition dawning, fear rising. Her mouth opened to scream, but the sound was cut short. Caleb moved fast, striking with precision, his blows muffled by blankets and flesh. The candle beside her toppled, wax spilling onto the rug. Silence returned. In the corridor, a door creaked open. Helen's nephew, the same boy who had spat in Caleb's face weeks before, stumbled into the hall, rubbing his eyes. He saw the figure in the fog-dim corridor, the axe glinting, the blood already staining Caleb's shirt. His gasp filled the air. Caleb rushed forward before the cry could escape, striking him down with a single motion. The laughter of that afternoon, the jeers, the spit echoed in Caleb's ears as the boy crumpled lifeless on the floorboards. The house began to stir. From the guest rooms came groans of waking men, the rustle of skirts as women shifted beneath quilts. Caleb moved with the swiftness of one who had memorized every step. He entered the parlor where two visiting cousins lay drunk across the settee. Their eyes blinked open, confusion replacing stupor, but they had no time to rise. The axe swept in arcs, swift and brutal, leaving silence in its wake. In the dining room, the long table still bore remnants of the feast half-eaten pies, overturned goblets, turkey bones stripped to gristle. Beside it slept Briggs, the overseer, his boots propped on a chair. The very man who had starved Caleb lashed him, threatened him with iron. Caleb's heart thundered as he stepped closer. Briggs stirred, perhaps sensing movement, his eyes blinking into the dim. "Who's there?" he muttered, voice rough with drink. Caleb's answer was the hiss of an axe cutting through air. Briggs jerked, tried to rise, but Caleb struck again, and the overseer's body crashed against the table. Dishes shattered, food scattering across the floor. Briggs groaned once before falling silent, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. The noise carried. Guests shouted, footsteps pounded on staircases, doors slammed open. Panic erupted through the house. Caleb moved like a storm, relentless, precise. A man lunged toward the bell rope in the hall, but Caleb intercepted him, the axe cleaving before the alarm could sound. Another tried to flee through the front door, but the fog swallowed him outside, and his cries ended abruptly in the yard where Caleb's blade found him. Within minutes, the great house was no longer a place of music and feast, but a theater of chaos. Screams rose and fell, feet thudded on wood, furniture overturned in desperate struggle. The women clutched children and fled toward carriages, their cries piercing. Men scrambled for pistols, but found themselves too slow against Caleb's fury. One by one, the adults who had laughed, jeered, or stayed silent as cruelty reigned fell beneath the blade. At last, Caleb reached the bell tower, that hated symbol of control. He seized the rope and pulled, the clang echoing once, twice across the plantation. Then, with a roar that seemed to rise from his very bones, he swung the axe into the mechanism. Wood splintered, iron cracked, and the bell, once used to summon or punish, crashed to the ground in ruin. Its silence was a declaration. Order had shattered. Breath ragged, Caleb tore the thief sign from where it still hung around his neck, ripping the rope in two. He flung the board into the fire, watching as the letters blackened, curled, and turned to ash. The label forced upon him was gone. The boy was no longer property, no longer victim. He was something else entirely. In the chaos, he found two young boys locked in the barn, their eyes wide with terror. Keys rattled in his bloody hands as he freed them, thrusting into their palms what food he could gather. A sack of corn, a pouch of salt. He told them in a steady voice that each must choose his own road. Freedom was a path no one could walk for another. They nodded, trembling, and fled into the mist. Caleb turned toward the back gate. The kitchen boy Jonah had done as promised. The latch hung loose. The fog outside beckoned, thick and merciful, its reeds and mud ready to swallow footprints. Behind him the house burned with noise, the plantation yard wild with panic, the cries of women and children clashing with the silence of men fallen. Ahead lay the swamp, dangerous, endless, but free. Caleb stepped through the gate without looking back. The mud closed over his tracks, reeds rustled, and the boy disappeared into the cypress shadows. By noon, riders thundered across the county with news. The bloody dawn at Cypress Bend. Patrols swept the riverbanks, slave cabins across parishes filled with fear as masters imposed harsher punishments. Yet in the hush of night, when the fires burned low and whispers spread among the quarters, a new story took root. It was not of fear nor of despair, but of Caleb. His name passed from mouth to mouth, carried like a hymn. Not as a boy humiliated on porches, not as a thief mocked by laughter, but as a sign-proof that the lash could be answered, that silence could turn into vengeance. By the time dawn's pale light broke fully across Cypress Bend, the once proud plantation was a ruin of silence and horror. The great house, its white pillars smeared with blood and fog, stood as a monument to the chaos of the night before. Doors gaped open, shutters banged against walls, and inside, bodies lay strewn across parlors and stairways, their lifeless eyes fixed in accusation at the ceilings they once ruled beneath. The scent of iron and spilled wine mingled in the air, cloying and sickening. The few who survived, maids, children, shaken guests, stumbled into the yard with faces white as linen. They spoke in stammers, incoherent fragments, of a shadow in the hall, of a boy with an axe, of the bell crashing down, of screams cut short. Some swore they had seen him vanish like a ghost into the swamp, as though the fog itself had swallowed him. Others claimed he still lingered in the shadows of the trees, waiting for the next victim. Fear spun rumor as fast as truth. Within hours, riders thundered down parish roads, delivering the cry, "The bloody dawn at Cypress Bend." Couriers galloped toward Natchez, toward Baton Rouge, even as far as New Orleans. The news spread with wildfire speed, igniting panic in every plantation household. At county seats, planters' faces grew pale, their voices shaking as they demanded immediate action. By noon, patrols formed along the river. Armed men on horseback combed the levees, their muskets gleaming in the sun. Bloodhounds were loosed, their howls echoing across the bayou. Boats pushed into the shallows, oars stirring the black water in search of footprints along the muddy banks. Every rustle of reeds, every bird startled into flight, drew volleys of shouts and gunfire, but Caleb was nowhere. The swamp, with its labyrinth of channels and its curtains of moss, swallowed him completely. At Cypress Bend itself, the overseer's body was dragged into the yard, his face covered with a sack, while carpenters nailed planks together for coffins. Mistress Halen's kin arrived by carriage, their grief boiling over into rage. They demanded retribution not just against the boy who had vanished, but against every soul still bound in the quarters. Whips cracked with renewed fury, iron collars clamped onto necks, shackles fastened to wrists and ankles. For days the cabins reeked of fear, the lash leaving raw welts on backs already scarred by years of punishment. Neighbors who had once toasted at the Halen table now stood grim-faced on the porch, vowing that such rebellion would never be allowed to spread. They spoke of harsher laws, of stricter patrols, of punishments so severe that no one would dare lift a hand again. Preachers thundered from pulpits the following Sunday, warning that Satan moves among the slaves and that order must be restored by the rod. Yet despite the terror, whispers rose in the cabins at night. Whispers of Caleb. Mothers rocked infants by the fire and hummed his name like a hidden hymn. Old men with trembling hands told the story as though it were already legend. The boy who struck down master and overseer, who silenced the bell, who vanished into the cypress fog with no chains on his wrists. Some said he had drowned in the swamp, his body swallowed by mud and roots. Others claimed he had slipped onto a riverboat at night, disguised among bales of cotton, bound northward toward freedom. A few swore they had seen him further upriver, walking along the levee with his axe slung across his back, eyes cold but steady. Whatever the truth, no search found him. The mud erased footprints, the reeds closed behind him, and the swamp held its secrets close. For Caleb, the swamp was both shield and trial. He moved through waist-deep water, the fog clinging to his skin, mosquitoes whining around his ears. Cypress knees jutted like spears from the muck, snakes slithered silently across the surface, and owls called in the night. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but he rationed the corn and salt taken from the barn, chewing slowly, forcing himself to endure. Every sound might be a patrol's hound, every ripple of water a musket barrel pointed his way. Yet he pressed deeper, guided not by maps, but by instinct and desperation. At night he listened to the wind. Sometimes it carried the distant shouts of men, the baying of dogs, the crack of an fire. Sometimes it brought only the cries of herons, the croak of frogs, the rustle of unseen creatures. Each time he lay still, body pressed against roots, breath shallow, waiting until silence returned. Days blurred, the swamp was endless, a world of water and shadow. Yet within its danger lay safety, for white men feared its depths. They skirted its edges but rarely dared to follow far. Caleb became part of it, mud on his skin, reeds tangled in his hair, his steps silent as he waded from channel to channel. He learned where the ground held firm, where the quicksand pulled, where fallen logs could bear his weight across black pools. He learned, too, that fear could be mastered, turned into focus. While patrols cursed and fired into the mist, Caleb's legend grew. Across plantations, whispers spread faster than dogs could track. That a boy had risen, that masters had fallen, that chains could break. Women bent over washboards repeated the tale in hushed voices. Men in the fields lifted their heads just slightly higher, their eyes flickering with something other than submission. Even children carried the name on their lips, whispering it as though it were a prayer. The planters tried to smother it with terror. They doubled the patrols, passed new edicts forbidding slaves from gathering after dark, forbidding them to read, to sing certain songs, even to whistle in the yards. Punishments grew harsher, 50 lashes for a missing tool, a week in irons for speaking out of turn, yet the story slipped through cracks like smoke. By January, the bloody dawn at Cypress Bend was spoken of as far as Baton Rouge. Planters gathered in taverns, voices low with fear. If one boy could do this, what might 100 do? If whispers turned to plans, if grief turned to fire, the whole South could burn. They clutched their cups tighter, ordered more whiskey, and swore vengeance. But in the cabins, in the secret corners of fields and kitchens, Caleb's name carried another weight. It was a reminder that fear was not the only master, that silence could break, that humiliation could turn into defiance, that even one boy could strike against the pillars of a house and bring them crashing down. And so the swamp kept its secret. The county searched in vain, and the name of Caleb moved like a shadow across Louisiana. Not as a runaway to be hunted, not as a thief to be shamed, but as a sign whispered into the night. That vengeance was possible, that freedom had a face, and that the cypress reeds would always remember. By February of 1860, Cypress Bend had become a scar across Louisiana's landscape. The once proud mansion was rebuilt in part, its pillars scrubbed and repainted, but no whitewash could hide the memory of that Christmas dawn. Guests who once laughed on the veranda now avoided the estate, speaking of it in whispers, as though the very soil carried a curse. The patrols had ended weeks earlier, their muskets empty of purpose. No trail had been found, no body recovered. The swamp had swallowed its fugitive whole, leaving only silence where hunters expected victory. Some planters insisted Caleb had drowned, dragged under by roots and snakes. Others swore he had escaped to New Orleans, or even to the north by way of a steamboat's hidden hold. None knew. The uncertainty gnawed at them worse than truth. Among enslaved people, however, certainty reigned. The boy lived. He had to. At night, in cabins lit only by coals, his story was told again and again. Mothers rocked children with the tale, reshaping it each time. Sometimes Caleb carried not just an axe, but a flaming torch. Sometimes he struck down not one master, but a dozen. Sometimes he walked out of the swamp taller, stronger, transformed into something no chains could bind. The details shifted, but the heart of the story never changed. One of their own had risen, and the world would never forget. On plantations miles away, men bent over hoes in the fields murmured his name under breath, the syllables like a heartbeat. Women at washtubs hummed his name into songs, hiding it beneath hymns so overseers would not notice. Children etched his initials into dirt with sticks, daring each other to speak them aloud. Even those too, broken by lashes, found strength in the whisper, Caleb. The masters sensed it. They saw the way eyes lifted more often, how conversations ceased abruptly when a patrol approached. They answered with harsher punishments, with iron collars, with chains rattled louder than ever. But fear could not smother the story. Every lash only deepened the conviction that Caleb's act had meaning. In March, at a market in Baton Rouge, a planter warned others that the name is a spark, we must stamp it out. Yet sparks, once lit, do not vanish. They drift, settle, and wait. And so it was with Caleb's name. It drifted beyond Cypress Bend, beyond Louisiana, into Mississippi, into Georgia, even whispered on the docks of Charleston. What had begun as one boy's fury became something larger, a reminder that power could crack, that order could bleed. Caleb's footprints were gone, but his story walked on, carried in voices too low for masters to hear, too strong for silence to erase. Whether he lived or died no longer mattered. Caleb had become something else, not just a boy of 16, humiliated and scarred, but a symbol. The cypress swamp had hidden his body, but his defiance rose higher than the tallest tree. And in the stillness of night, when chains rattled and whips cracked, a whisper always followed. He struck back.